Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Louisiana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1844, a transaction was recorded in the parish records of St. Francisville, West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana. The yellowed pages, now preserved in the State Historical Archives, document the purchase of a woman named Clara Mayfield by plantation owner Henry Duval for 12 cents, an anomalous price that would later become the subject of much speculation among historians. What the official record failed to mention was that Clara was with child, and what no document would ever state was the identity of the father. The story of Henry Duval and Clara Mayfield might have remained buried in the forgotten corners of American history had it not been for the discovery of a collection of personal correspondences in 1963, when the old Duval plantation house was scheduled for demolition. A construction worker found a metal box hidden beneath the floorboards of what had once been the master bedroom. Inside were letters, diary entries, and a small leather-bound ledger that would shed light on one of Louisiana's darkest family secrets. The Duval plantation stood approximately 5 miles south of St. Francisville, on fertile land that stretched from the Mississippi River to the rolling hills that characterized the region. The main house was a 2-story structure with large white columns and wide verandas, typical of the antebellum architecture. By all accounts, it was neither the grandest nor the most modest of the plantations that dotted the Louisiana landscape at that time. What set it apart was not its appearance, but the events that transpired within its walls. Henry Duval was born in 1800 and came from a lineage of plantation owners who had established themselves in Louisiana shortly after the territory was purchased from France. According to parish records, he inherited the plantation following the untimely death of his brother Richard Duval in July of 1844. Richard, the elder of the two, had managed the family business with considerable success for nearly 20 years. His death was attributed to a fever, though some accounts suggest it may have been the result of a duel, a not uncommon fate for men of his standing during that era. Clara Mayfield's origins are more difficult to trace. Slave records from the period are notoriously incomplete, and Clara appears in the official documentation only at the moment of her purchase by Henry Duval. Based on estimates from the physician's notes found among the discovered papers, she would have been approximately 25 years old at the time and was described as being 5 months with child. What makes this case particularly unusual is not merely the nominal price for which Clara was purchased, but the circumstances surrounding the transaction. According to the plantation's previous owner's ledger, presumed to be Richard Duval's personal accounting, Clara had been sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi just 2 months before Richard's death. Her return to the Duval plantation, now under Henry's ownership, suggests a deliberate effort to bring her back, though the motivation remained unclear until the discovery of the hidden correspondences. The documents reveal a complex narrative that unfolded over several months following Richard's death and culminated in events that local residents would speak of only in whispers for generations to come. This is the story of the Duval plantation, of Henry and Clara, and of a secret that would haunt the property long after its original occupants were laid to rest. In the weeks following his brother's funeral, Henry Duval made several significant changes to the plantation's operations. The overseer, a man named Thomas Wilkins, who had served under Richard for 15 years, was dismissed without explanation. Several domestic servants who had worked closely with Richard were relocated to field work, and the master bedroom, Richard's former quarters, remained locked and unused. These actions, noted with disapproval in the diary of a neighbouring plantation owner's wife, were initially attributed to grief or perhaps to Henry's inexperience in managing such a large operation. Mr. H. Duval appears determined to undo much of his brother's work, wrote Mrs. Eliza Montgomery in September of 1844. One wonders if jealousy might be at the root of such decisions, as Richard's success has cast a long shadow. What Mrs. Montgomery and others in the local society could not have known was that Henry had discovered something among his brother's personal effects, something that would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead him to seek out and purchase Clara Mayfield. According to a personal letter Henry wrote to his cousin in Virginia, never sent but found among the hidden documents, he had come across a series of entries in Richard's private journal that suggested an improper relationship with one of the household servants. The journal itself was not among the discovered items, and Henry's letter does not specify the nature of what he read, referring only to conduct unbecoming a Duval and a stain upon our family name. What is clear from subsequent documentation is that Henry became obsessed with locating Clara Mayfield after reading these entries. Records from a bank in Natchez indicate that Henry withdrew a substantial sum in early September, and travel receipts show he journeyed to Mississippi shortly thereafter. By early October, Clara was back at the Duval plantation, purchased for the token sum of 12 cents, a price that suggests the transaction was more complex than a simple sale. The physician's records, dated October 12, 1844, note that Clara was with child, approximately 5 months along, and in good health despite the rigors of recent travel. The same document includes a curious notation. Patient confirms conception occurred in early May. Master requests this information be recorded officially. May of 1844 was 4 months before Richard Duval's death. If Clara had been 5 months pregnant in October, simple arithmetic places the time of conception during a period when she would have still been living on the Duval plantation under Richard's ownership. Henry's motivation for bringing Clara back to the plantation became the subject of much speculation among the few who were aware of the situation. Some of the documents suggest he initially intended to confirm his suspicions about his brother's behavior and then resell Clara to a plantation farther south. A draft of a letter to a broker in New Orleans indicates as much. Yet something changed in the weeks following Clara's return. The household accounts show that Clara was not assigned to field work, as might have been expected, but was instead given duties in the house, specifically in organizing and cataloging the library, a task that would have required literacy, an uncommon skill among enslaved individuals at the time. This assignment placed her in regular proximity to Henry, who, according to his own sporadic journal entries, spent increasingly more time in the library during this period. November brought the first frost to the region, and with it came visitors to the Duval plantation. Henry's cousin from Virginia, James Duval, arrived with his wife for what was intended to be a brief stay on their way to New Orleans. Their visit, however, would extend to nearly 3 weeks, during which time the first cracks in Henry's carefully constructed narrative began to appear. James's wife, Catherine, a woman described in contemporary accounts as observant to a fault and loose with her opinions, took particular notice of Clara's condition and position in the household. In a letter to her sister, written after their departure from the plantation, she remarked, "The woman is clearly with child, and yet is treated with a deference that borders on impropriety." When I made mention of this to Henry, his reaction was most severe. I fear there is something unwholesome in his interest in the woman's condition. By December, as Clara's pregnancy advanced, Henry's behavior grew increasingly erratic. The plantation's accounts show neglect. Orders for supplies went unplaced, correspondence went unanswered, and decisions about the winter planting were delayed until almost too late. The neighboring Montgomery Plantation's records note that Henry was seen riding the boundaries of his property at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, as if searching for something or someone. It was during this period that Henry began to make significant changes to the east wing of the house, an area that had previously contained several storage rooms and a small study. Workers' records indicate that the rooms were being converted into what appeared to be private quarters, an unusual arrangement that sparked gossip among both the household staff and neighboring plantations. As the year drew to a close, tension on the plantation continued to rise. The overseer, who had replaced Thomas Wilkins, reported increasing difficulty in managing the field hands, noting that rumors about strange goings-on in the main house were affecting morale and productivity. In his report to Henry, dated December 28th, he wrote, "The men speak of sounds coming from the east wing at night. Some refuse to work near the house after sundown. I have administered discipline as needed, but the problem persists." Henry's response, scrawled at the bottom of the report, was terse. "Increase rations for the Christmas period. Any who continue to spread tales will be sold come spring." The new year of 1845 began with an ice storm that blanketed the region for nearly a week. The plantation was effectively isolated during this time, with roads impassable and the river partially frozen. It was in these conditions on January 9th that Clara Mayfield gave birth. The physician who had been attending her was unable to reach the plantation due to the weather. According to the household records, the birth was attended by the cook, an older woman named Martha, and overseen by Henry himself, an unprecedented level of involvement for a plantation owner. The child, a boy, was born just after midnight. No official record of the birth exists in the parish documents, though Henry made an entry in the family Bible, another item recovered from the hidden cache. The entry reads simply, "A male child born to Clara, January 9, 1845. No name is recorded, and the space where the father's name would traditionally be written was left blank." In the weeks following the birth, Henry's behavior became even more unusual. The household accounts show he ordered fine fabric from New Orleans for infant garments and instructed that a cradle be brought down from the attic. The same cradle, servants later reported, that had been used for both Richard and Henry when they were infants. Clara and the child were installed in the newly renovated rooms in the East Wing, and Henry gave strict instructions that they were not to be disturbed except by Martha, who was assigned to assist with the infant's care. His journal entries from this period are fragmented and often incoherent, shifting between expressions of rage toward his deceased brother and what appears to be an increasing obsession with the child. "The eyes," he wrote on January 20th. "Unmistakable, the same shape, the same color. Even Martha remarked upon it before I silenced her. How could he have been so careless, so selfish? The resemblance will only grow stronger with time." By February, word of the unusual situation had spread beyond the boundaries of the plantation. The pastor of the church in St. Francisville made a visit, ostensibly to check on the spiritual well-being of the household following the difficulties of the winter. His actual motivation, as revealed in a letter to the bishop, was to investigate rumors that had reached him regarding an inappropriate arrangement between Mr. Duval and an enslaved woman and her newborn child. Henry refused to allow the pastor beyond the main parlor and became agitated when questions about Clara and the baby were raised. According to the pastor's account, Henry insisted that family matters are private concerns and suggested that the church might wish to reconsider its acceptance of the Duval family's generous annual donation if its representatives could not respect this privacy. The pastor left without seeing either Clara or the child, but his concerns were not allayed. In his letter to the bishop he noted, "There is a darkness in that house that goes beyond the usual sins of men. I fear not just for the moral standing of Mr. Duval, but for the safety of those under his care." The pastor's concerns were not without merit. By March, the situation on the Duval plantation had deteriorated further. The overseer resigned his position, citing in his letter that he could no longer bear the weight of unnatural practices taking place on the property. 3 field hands attempted to escape, though they were captured and returned. And Henry, according to his own sporadic writings, had begun to spend nights in a chair outside Clara's door, ostensibly to protect her and the child. From what or whom he felt they needed protection is unclear, though his writings make increasingly frequent reference to his belief that his brother's spirit was attempting to claim the child. "I hear him in the walls," Henry wrote in early March, "his footsteps on the stairs. When the wind blows from the east, I can hear him calling the boy's name, the name he has no right to bestow." The child, it seems, had still not been formally named, though Henry had taken to referring to him as the heir in his private writings, a designation that carried profound implications given the legal and social structures of the time. Clara's own thoughts and experiences during this period are largely absent from the historical record, a common erasure of enslaved individuals' perspectives. What little can be gleaned comes from Martha's testimony, recorded decades later when she was interviewed as part of a Freedmen's Bureau documentation project in 1873. According to Martha, whose recollections must be understood within the context of the nearly 30 years that had passed, Clara was neither prisoner nor free in her new quarters. She was provided with comforts unusual for someone in her position: clean clothes, adequate food, books, but was forbidden from leaving the East Wing without Henry's permission, which was rarely granted. Miss Clara, she knew things weren't right, Martha recalled. She kept that baby close, wouldn't let him out of her sight. When Master Henry came to visit, which was most every day and sometimes in the night, she would hold that child like she was afraid he might snatch him away. By April of 1845, the tensions within the Duval household had reached a breaking point. The plantation's productivity had declined dramatically, and neighboring landowners had begun to distance themselves from Henry, declining invitations and failing to include him in the usual social gatherings. In mid-April, Henry made the unexpected decision to travel to New Orleans, leaving the plantation under the supervision of a hastily hired new overseer. According to the travel documents and receipts found among his papers, he stayed in the city for just over a week, during which time he met with a lawyer and made revisions to his will, a copy of which was included in the discovered documents. The will, dated April 23, 1845, contains several remarkable provisions. Most significantly, it states that the male child born to the woman Clara, currently residing at Duval Plantation, should, upon Henry's death, be granted his freedom and transported to a northern state, where arrangements would be made for his education and upbringing. A substantial sum was to be held in trust for this purpose. The will also specifies that Clara was to be manumitted upon my death and provided with sufficient funds to establish herself independently, should she choose to accompany the child. If she declined, she was to be sold to a household in New Orleans, where her literacy and domestic skills would be valued and harsh treatment prohibited. These provisions, had they become public knowledge during Henry's lifetime, would have caused a scandal of considerable proportion. Manumission was legal in Louisiana at the time, but increasingly difficult to execute and socially frowned upon. More telling was the implication that Henry recognized some form of obligation to the child, an obligation that went well beyond what would have been expected even from a particularly conscientious slave owner. Henry returned from New Orleans on April 30th, bringing with him a new household manager, a Frenchwoman named Madame Beaumont, who, according to her contract, was hired specifically to oversee the education and proper raising of the child residing in the East Wing. The contract explicitly stated that she was to report directly to Henry and was not to discuss her duties with anyone outside the household. Madame Beaumont's arrival marked a shift in the household dynamics. Henry began to spend less time obsessively monitoring Clara and the child, delegating daily oversight to the Frenchwoman. His journal entries from May and early June suggest a period of relative calm, with his attention returning to plantation business and efforts to repair relationships with neighboring landowners. This calm, however, was shattered in late June when an unexpected visitor arrived at the plantation. Margaret Duval, Richard's widow, who had been staying with relatives in Charleston following her husband's death. No record exists of the conversation between Henry and his sister-in-law, but its effects are evident in the subsequent chain of events. Within hours of Margaret's departure, she did not stay the night, despite the distance she had travelled. Henry ordered the overseer to place Clara under guard. Madame Beaumont was dismissed with 1 month's pay and a stern warning about the consequences of loose talk. Henry's writings in the days following this visit reveal a man in the grip of paranoia. "She knows," he wrote repeatedly, "or suspects, which amounts to the same. The resemblance is too strong to deny. She will return, perhaps with authorities. Preparations must be made." The preparations Henry referred to appear to have involved plans to relocate Clara and the child. Maps found among his papers show routes to Texas, then still an independent republic and beyond the immediate reach of American authorities. Notes calculating costs and supplies suggest he intended to send them west with a trusted guide, though whether Clara was to be informed of or had consented to this plan is unclear. These preparations, however, would never be completed. On the evening of July 3rd, 1845, a fire broke out in the east wing of the Duval plantation house. The fire was discovered shortly after midnight by a field hand who had been returning from visiting his wife on a neighboring plantation. By the time he raised the alarm and the household was roused, the east wing was almost completely engulfed in flames. According to witness accounts collected by the local authorities, Henry rushed into the burning structure, presumably to rescue Clara and the child. None of the three emerged. When the fire was finally extinguished in the early hours of the morning, 3 bodies were recovered from the ruins, an adult male identified as Henry Duval by his signet ring, an adult female presumed to be Clara, though severe burning made identification difficult, and the remains of an infant approximately 6 months old. The official report, filed by the parish sheriff on July 10th, ruled the fire an accident, likely caused by an overturned lamp. This conclusion was accepted without significant questioning, perhaps due to the Duval family's standing in the community, or perhaps because few were interested in probing too deeply into matters that might prove discomforting. The bodies were buried on the plantation grounds, Henry in the family plot, and Clara and the child in unmarked graves at the edge of the property, a detail noted with disapproval by Mrs. Montgomery in her diary, who felt that, regardless of station, the woman and innocent babe deserved Christian burial. With no direct heirs, the Duval plantation passed to a cousin from the Virginia branch of the family, who sold it less than a year later to a family from Alabama. The new owners were reportedly troubled by unexplained noises in the rebuilt East Wing, and eventually abandoned those rooms entirely, using them for storage until the house was finally slated for demolition in 1963. The story might have ended there, consigned to local legend and eventually forgotten, had it not been for two additional documents found in the hidden cache that cast doubt on the official narrative of that July night. The first is a receipt from a steamboat captain dated July 2nd, 1845, the day before the fire, acknowledging payment for passage for one woman and infant from the St. Francisville landing to Natchez, with connecting passage arranged to New Orleans. The receipt is signed by Henry Duval. The second is a fragment of a letter partially burned along one edge, written in what handwriting experts have identified as Clara's hand. Dated simply July, it reads, "The arrangements have been made as you directed. We will depart tomorrow before dawn. Your generosity will not be forgotten, though I cannot ever forgive what brought us to this point. May God have mercy on both our souls for what we have done and what we have failed to do." These documents suggest a narrative significantly different from the official account. They raise the possibility that Clara and her child may have escaped the fire, perhaps were never present for it at all, and that their bodies were not among those found in the ruins. If true, the identity of the third victim becomes a mystery, as does the true fate of Clara and the infant. Local historians have suggested that Henry may have arranged a staged escape for Clara and the child, only to have the plan go tragically awry. Others propose a darker theory, that Henry, upon learning that Margaret had discovered his secret and fearing the social and legal consequences, may have chosen to end his life and create the appearance that Clara and the child had perished with him, thereby allowing them to escape to a new life without pursuit. The truth may never be known with certainty. The Duval plantation house is long gone, the land now part of a modern agricultural operation. The graves, if they still exist, have never been located or exhumed. The documents, after being studied by historians in the 1960s, were archived in the State Historical Society's collection, where they remain available to researchers but have attracted relatively little attention outside academic circles. Yet the story persists in the oral traditions of St. Francisville. Some residents claim that on hot summer nights, particularly around the anniversary of the fire, the sound of a woman singing a lullaby can be heard in the vicinity of where the east wing once stood. Others speak of a sense of being watched when they pass the former plantation grounds, as if someone or something is still keeping guard over secrets long buried. Perhaps most intriguing are the records from a small African-American church in Cincinnati, Ohio, dated 1852, which list among its members a woman named Clara and her son, Richard. The church records note that they had arrived from the South some years earlier and that the boy was being educated at a school established for free black children. The woman was described as literate and accomplished in household management. Could this have been Clara Mayfield and the child born on the Duval plantation? The name Richard, the same as Henry's deceased brother, would be a telling choice if it were. But like so much of this story, it remains a tantalizing possibility rather than a confirmed fact. What is certain is that the events at the Duval plantation in 1844 and 1845 encapsulate much of the moral complexity and human tragedy of the antebellum South. The relationship between Richard Duval and Clara Mayfield, whatever its nature, Henry's response to the child he believed to be his brother's son, the fire that may have been accident, murder, suicide, or elaborate deception, all speak to the profound distortions of humanity that the institution of slavery both enabled and required. In the end, perhaps the most honest epitaph for this dark chapter in Louisiana's history comes from Martha, the former cook who survived to see emancipation. When asked about the events at the Duval plantation, she reportedly said, "There are some sins that burn too hot for this world to contain. Sometimes they burn right through, leaving nothing but ash and questions that ain't never going to be answered this side of Judgment Day." The land where the Duval plantation once stood appears unremarkable to modern eyes. Crops grow, seasons change, and most visitors pass by without a second glance. But for those who know the story, the quiet fields seem to hold their secrets close, a reminder that history's darkest chapters are often written not in the official records, but in the spaces between what was documented and what was deliberately left unsaid. In 1968, a graduate student researching antebellum plantation life claimed to have found additional Duval family documents in a private collection in Virginia. Before his research could be published, however, he withdrew from his program, citing personal reasons. The documents he claimed to have discovered have never been located, and some scholars question whether they ever existed. His last academic correspondence, sent to his advisor at Tulane University, contained a curious postscript. "I've decided to redirect my research away from the Duval matter. Some doors, once opened, cannot easily be closed again. Some questions, once asked, follow you into the dark." The graduate student's abandoned research might have been the final chapter in the Duval saga, had it not been for a series of events that began in the spring of 1969. A woman named Eleanor Beaumont, claiming to be a descendant of the French household manager hired briefly by Henry Duval, contacted the Louisiana Historical Society with an offer to donate family papers that she believed might be relevant to their archives. Among these papers was a journal kept by Madame Beaumont during her brief employment at the Duval plantation and in the years following. The journal, written in French and later translated by scholars at Tulane University, provides a perspective on events that had previously been absent from the historical record. According to Madame Beaumont's account, the child born to Clara was indeed Richard Duval's son, conceived during a relationship that, while not consensual in any meaningful sense given Clara's enslaved status, had developed over several months prior to Richard's death. "The elder, Mr. Duval," she wrote, "spoke often of his intention to purchase the woman's freedom and establish her in a house in New Orleans, where he might visit their child without scandal. Whether this was a genuine intention or merely a means of securing her cooperation, I cannot say. Richard's sudden death, which Madame Beaumont suggests, was not the result of fever or duel, but rather a deliberate act of self-harm following a confrontation with his wife, Margaret, who had discovered the relationship, left Clara in a precarious position. According to the journal, Richard had already arranged for Clara's sale to the plantation in Mississippi as a temporary measure, intending to establish her in New Orleans once Margaret had returned to her family in Charleston. Henry's discovery of his brother's private papers after his death revealed not only the relationship, but also these plans. His initial reaction, according to Madame Beaumont, was one of moral outrage combined with concern for the family's reputation. "Mr. Henry Duval spoke of his brother's conduct in terms of the strongest condemnation," she wrote, "yet I observed that his gaze would often linger on the woman's growing belly, and there was something in his manner that suggested not merely righteous anger, but a deeper, more personal disturbance." The most revelatory portions of Madame Beaumont's journal concern the period immediately before the fire. She writes that Henry had become increasingly erratic, alternating between periods of cold calculation and emotional volatility. According to her account, he had begun to speak of the unborn child as the last Duval, despite its illegitimacy and mixed parentage, concepts that would have been insurmountable barriers in the legal and social context of the time. More disturbing were his late-night visits to the East Wing, where Madame Beaumont claimed he would sit for hours outside Clara's room, sometimes speaking in low tones to himself or to some unseen presence he addressed as Richard. On one occasion, she reported finding him holding the infant, then about 5 months old, by an open window in the middle of the night, staring out into the darkness as if contemplating some terrible action. It was this incident that prompted her to approach Clara with an offer of assistance. "I told her I feared for the safety of both her and the child," Madame Beaumont wrote. "Mr. Duval's behavior had become increasingly unpredictable, and I had reason to believe he might be capable of harm, despite his apparent concern for their welfare." According to the journal, Clara had already reached a similar conclusion. She confided that she had overheard Mr. Duval in conversation with what he believed to be his brother's spirit, Madame Beaumont recorded. He spoke of sending the child to join its father, and of cleansing the family line. She understood, as did I, that these were not merely the ramblings of a disturbed mind, but potentially deadly intentions. Together, they formulated a plan. Madame Beaumont would use her day off to travel to St. Francisville and secure passage on a steamboat bound for Natchez. Clara and the child would be smuggled out of the house before dawn on the appointed day, with the assistance of Martha, who had family connections among the riverboat workers. The plan was set in motion, but encountered an unexpected complication with the arrival of Margaret Duval. Contrary to the official narrative, Margaret had not come to confront Henry about Clara and the child. According to Madame Beaumont, she had come to offer a solution. She would take the child north, where it could be placed with a family who would raise it as their own, removing the threat to the Duval family's reputation. Henry's reaction to this proposal was violent and immediate. He accused Margaret of attempting to steal the last pure Duval blood and threatened to expose her own indiscretions if she did not leave immediately and forever. This confrontation, witnessed by Madame Beaumont from an adjoining room, confirmed her fears about Henry's deteriorating mental state. The planned escape was accelerated. Instead of waiting for the scheduled departure date, Madame Beaumont arranged for Clara and the child to be taken to the river landing that very night. She herself was to follow the next day, after collecting the final payment owed to her and gathering her belongings in a manner that would not arouse suspicion. What transpired next is described by Madame Beaumont in entries made several days after the fire, when she had reached New Orleans. According to her account, Clara and the child were successfully removed from the plantation and transported to the steamboat, which departed upriver toward Natchez as scheduled. Madame Beaumont remained behind, intending to leave the following morning. She was awakened in the middle of the night by the smell of smoke and the sounds of shouting. From her window she could see that the east wing was ablaze. In the confusion that followed, she observed Henry running not toward the fire, as later reported, but away from it, toward the family cemetery where Richard was buried. Madame Beaumont took advantage of the chaos to depart the plantation immediately, taking only what she could carry and making her way to St. Francisville on foot. There she boarded the first available boat to New Orleans, where she later learned of Henry's reported death in the fire. Her journal entries express skepticism about this account. "I cannot be certain of what occurred after my departure," she wrote, "but I know with absolute certainty that Clara and the child were not in the east wing when the fire began. They were miles away, on a steamboat bound for Natchez. If bodies resembling theirs were found in the ruins, they must have been other unfortunates whose identities were obscured by the flames." As for Henry, Madame Beaumont speculates that he may have indeed perished in the fire, perhaps after returning to the burning building for some unknown purpose. Alternatively, she suggests, he may have used the fire as cover for his own disappearance, a theory supported by reported sightings of a man resembling Henry in New Orleans in the months following the fire, though these accounts cannot be verified. The Beaumont Journal provides a compelling alternative narrative to the official account, but like all historical sources, it must be approached with critical awareness. Madame Beaumont was writing after the fact, possibly with knowledge of how events were publicly reported. Her own role in the escape plan gives her a vested interest in portraying her actions in a positive light. And the journal itself, while appearing authentic to experts who have examined it, cannot be definitively proven to date from the period in question. Yet the journal's account aligns with certain established facts: the steamboat receipt found among Henry's papers, Clara's partially burned letter, and the church records from Cincinnati that might indicate her and her son's later whereabouts. It also provides explanations for elements that the official narrative left unclear, such as the identity of the bodies found in the fire and the nature of Henry's increasingly erratic behavior in the weeks preceding it. Perhaps most significantly, the Beaumont Journal suggests a dimension to the story that goes beyond the personal tragedy of those directly involved. It speaks to the broader moral catastrophe of the institution of slavery and the profound distortions it created, not only in the lives of the enslaved, but in the psychology and social relationships of the enslavers themselves. The journal's final entry relating to the Duval matter, dated December 25, 1845, records a brief encounter in New Orleans. Today, while attending Christmas service at the cathedral, I glimpsed a woman who bore a striking resemblance to C. She was accompanied by a male child of appropriate age. Our eyes met briefly across the crowded space, and I believe recognition passed between us, though no acknowledgement was made. She was dressed in the manner of a free woman of color of modest means, and the child appeared healthy and well cared for. I did not approach, as I believe both of us prefer that certain connections remain unacknowledged. Some secrets are better kept, not for the protection of the guilty, but for the peace of those who have already suffered enough. Whether this sighting was indeed Clara and her son, whether they eventually made their way to Cincinnati, as the church records might suggest, whether they lived out their lives in freedom or encountered further hardships, these questions remain unanswered. The historical record, always incomplete, is particularly sparse when it comes to the lives of those who existed at the margins of society. The Duval plantation itself left few physical traces. The land was subdivided and sold in the early 1900s. The family cemetery relocated to a church in St. Francisville, the ruins of the house eventually cleared away entirely. Today, the site is marked only by a small historical plaque, noting that a plantation once stood there, with no mention of the events of 1844 and 1845. Yet the story has persisted in local oral tradition, passed down through generations of residents, each adding their own interpretations and embellishments. Some versions claim that the fire was set deliberately by other enslaved individuals on the plantation as an act of resistance or revenge. Others suggest that Margaret Duval returned with authorities, or hired men who were responsible for the blaze. Still others embrace supernatural elements, speaking of Richard's ghost driving his brother to madness, or of Henry practicing dark rituals in an attempt to communicate with the dead. These variations reflect not just the malleability of memory and the human tendency to reshape narratives over time, but also the difficulty of confronting a history built on fundamental injustice. The story of Henry Duval, Clara Mayfield, and the child born between two worlds is, at its core, a story about the impossibility of maintaining human connections within a system designed to deny the humanity of those it enslaved. In 1972, a descendant of the Montgomery family, whose plantation had neighbored the Duvals, donated additional papers to the state archives. Among them was a letter written by Eliza Montgomery to her sister in Virginia, dated September 1845, 2 months after the fire. In it, she mentions hearing from a reliable source in New Orleans that a woman fitting Clara's description had been seen boarding a ship bound for Liverpool, accompanied by a child and a French-speaking woman who might have been Madame Beaumont. "If it is indeed the woman I suspect," Mrs. Montgomery wrote, "then I can only thank Providence for her escape from that house of shadows." There was a sickness there that had nothing to do with fever or physical ailment, a sickness of the soul that infected all who dwelled within those walls. Henry Duval was a man consumed by his brother's sins and his own, unable to distinguish between justice and vengeance, between protection and possession. If the woman and her innocent child have indeed found their way to distant shores, I pray they find there the peace and liberty that was denied them here. The possibility that Clara and her son might have reached England opens yet another avenue of speculation. The United Kingdom had abolished slavery throughout its territories in 1833, and Liverpool, though historically a centre of the slave trade, had by the 1840s become home to a small but significant community of free black individuals, some of whom had escaped from American slavery. Records from a parish in Liverpool show the baptism in April 1846 of a boy named Richard, approximately 15 months old, born to a mother named Clara. The child's surname is listed as Freeman, a common choice for formerly enslaved individuals and a poignant statement of newfound liberty. No father is named in the baptismal record. Further traces of their lives become increasingly difficult to follow. Britain's census records from 1851 list a Clara Freeman, described as a seamstress, born in the United States, living in a modest house in Liverpool with a child of approximately 6 years. By the 1861 census, they no longer appear, having perhaps moved elsewhere in Britain, returned to the United States following emancipation, or perhaps died in one of the epidemics that periodically swept through urban areas during the period. If Clara and her son did reach England and establish lives there, they would have escaped not only the immediate dangers they faced at the Duval plantation, but also the decades of legal enslavement, followed by segregation and racial violence. That would have been their likely fate had they remained in the American South. The child, born into a system that defined him as property, might instead have grown up in a society where, while certainly not free from prejudice, he would have had legal rights and opportunities unimaginable on the plantation where he was born. This possibility, that from the ashes of the Duval plantation might have emerged not just survival, but a kind of freedom, offers a rare note of potential redemption in a story otherwise characterized by moral failure and human suffering. It suggests that even within systems designed to deny agency and humanity, individuals might still find ways to resist, to escape, to create lives on their own terms. Yet it remains just that, a possibility, not a certainty. The historical record, with its gaps and silences, its biases and omissions, cannot provide definitive answers. We know that Henry Duval purchased Clara Mayfield for 12 cents in 1844. We know that a child was born. We know that a fire destroyed the east wing of the plantation house in July 1845. Beyond these bare facts lies a realm of interpretation, speculation, and imagination. Perhaps this uncertainty is fitting. The story of the Duval plantation is, in many ways, a story about secrets, about what is hidden, what is revealed, what is preserved, and what is destroyed. The hidden documents, the unacknowledged relationships, the suppressed truths, the narratives constructed to maintain social order and family reputation, all speak to the elaborate architectures of denial that supported the institution of slavery and continue to shape how we understand its legacy. In 2002, an archaeological survey was conducted on a portion of the former Duval plantation land in preparation for a highway expansion project. Among the findings were the foundations of what appeared to be the east wing of the main house, with clear evidence of the fire that had destroyed it. Beneath the charred remains, in what would have been a space between the walls, workers discovered a small metal box containing 3 items: a child's shoe, a man's pocket watch with the initials RD engraved on the case, and a folded piece of paper. The paper, badly deteriorated but still partially legible, appeared to be a note written in a feminine hand. The few words that could be deciphered read, "May God forgive what we have done. The truth will, in blood and fire. These artifacts, now preserved in the State Museum, raise more questions than they answer. Who placed them in the wall and when? What truth did the writer believe would be revealed in blood and fire? Was it Clara, leaving a final testament before her escape? Was it Henry, in a moment of lucidity or remorse? Was it someone else entirely, perhaps Martha or another member of the household who knew more than they ever publicly revealed? Like so much about the Duval plantation, these questions remain open, the full truth just beyond reach. The land where the house once stood has been paved over now, the highway carrying thousands of travelers each day over ground that once witnessed a family's unraveling and perhaps a woman and child's journey toward freedom. Few of those passing by know the story of what happened there, and fewer still pause to consider its implications. Yet for those who study the past, not merely as a collection of facts, but as a mirror in which we might glimpse reflections of ourselves, the story of Henry Duval and Clara Mayfield remains profoundly relevant. It speaks to the complexity of human relationships, to the damage inflicted by systems of oppression on oppressed and oppressor alike, to the persistence of memory even when there are concerted efforts to forget. In the fall of 2022, a woman visited the state archives and requested access to all materials relating to the Duval plantation. She identified herself as a graduate student researching antebellum Louisiana, but archive staff later noted that she asked no questions about agricultural practices, economic systems, or architectural features, the usual concerns of scholarly research on plantations. Instead, she focused exclusively on the personal papers, the journals, the letters, the accounts of the fire. After several days of research, she approached the head archivist with a remarkable claim. She believed herself to be a descendant of Clara Mayfield and her son Richard, tracing her lineage through the Liverpool connection and eventually back to the United States in the early 20th century. She had grown up hearing fragments of a family story about ancestors who had escaped from a plantation fire, though the details had become confused over generations. When asked what had prompted her to investigate this specific plantation among the hundreds that had existed in Louisiana, she produced a small silver locket. Inside was a tiny portrait miniature of a man in early 19th century dress. Though faded with age, his features were still discernible: high forehead, deep-set eyes, a certain tension around the mouth. On the back of the locket, barely visible, were engraved the initials R.D. "My grandmother gave me this," the woman said. "She told me it had been passed down through the women in our family for generations. She said it was a reminder of where we came from and of how far we had traveled to be free." The archivist, who had spent decades working with the historical materials of the region, examined the locket carefully. He could not authenticate it on the spot, of course. Proper verification would require expert analysis, but he acknowledged that the style and craftsmanship were consistent with the period, and the likeness bore a certain resemblance to the few existing descriptions of Richard Duval. "If this is genuine," he told the woman, "then you're holding a remarkable piece of history, not just of your family, but of this region, this country." The woman nodded. "History isn't just what's written in the official records," she said. "It's what's remembered, what's passed down, what survives despite everything that conspires to erase it." She declined to leave the locket for further study, saying it was too personal, too precious to part with even temporarily. Instead, she allowed photographs to be taken for the archives and promised to consider more formal authentication at a later date. Before leaving, she asked to see the small metal box found during the archaeological survey, the one containing the child's shoe, the pocket watch, and the fragmentary note. Standing before the museum display case, she gazed at these artifacts for a long time in silence. "What do you think it means?" the archivist finally asked. The note, the buried box. What do you think they were trying to preserve or communicate? The woman considered the question. I think, she said slowly, that someone wanted to ensure that even if the official story was accepted, even if appearances were maintained and reputations preserved, there would still be this physical evidence that would raise questions, that would resist the neat conclusions, that would keep the truth, whatever it might be, from being entirely buried. She looked once more at the tiny shoe, the watch, the paper with its few legible words. Maybe that's all we can really hope for, she said. Not complete answers, but enough fragments to keep us questioning, to remind us that history is always more complex, more human than the stories we tell ourselves about it. With that, she thanked the archivist and departed, taking with her the locket that might, or might not, establish a direct line between the present day and the events at the Duval plantation more than 175 years earlier. The archivist, watching her go, was struck by a curious sensation, not quite déjà vu, but something adjacent to it. He had the sudden, irrational feeling that he had seen this scene before, or would see it again. A person coming to search for answers about the Duval plantation, finding some threads but never the complete tapestry, and departing with more questions than they had arrived with. It was as if the story was somehow still unfolding, still seeking its resolution, the characters long dead, but their actions continuing to ripple outward through time, as if the fire that had consumed the east wing of the plantation house had never really gone out, but was still burning somewhere, casting light and shadow across the decades, illuminating some aspects of the truth while leaving others in darkness. The woman's visit was duly noted in the archive's records, one more layer added to the accumulation of documents, artifacts, and testimonies that constitute our imperfect understanding of the past. Her photographs of the locket were filed away, her connection to Clara Mayfield and the child neither proven nor disproven. And the story of Henry Duval, who purchased a pregnant enslaved woman for 12 cents, and thereby set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in fire and disappearance, remains what it has always been. A whisper from the shadows of American history, a tale told in fragments and silences, in what was documented and what was deliberately left unsaid. For those who listen closely, it speaks still of the prices paid, in suffering, in blood, in fire, for the sins of the past, and of the long, difficult journey towards something that might, with enough distance and courage, eventually resemble redemption.